Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight is the season finale in our regular series of public events, the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. I'd like to thank CIGI's public events sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. As well, our co-sponsor for tonight's event, as always for this annual Foreign Correspondents panel, is the Canadian International Council, the CIC. I'd like to welcome to the stage now the President of the Waterloo chapter of the CIC, Joan Eiler, who will offer a few words of welcome.
Good evening. My name is Joan Eiler. I'm President of the Waterloo Region Branch. I'd like to welcome you here this evening, and we're in for a very exciting evening. I'd also like to mention that we have a dinner sponsor this evening, and Deloitte, and Mr. Adam Burke is sitting in the front row here with us. Whoopsie, sorry about that. I'd also like to thank Fred Kuntz and Colleen Fitzpatrick for the large role they played in bringing these journalists together and the program, helping with the program. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to give it back to Fred to introduce the panel.
Now, besides the audience here tonight at the CIGI Atrium, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast available anywhere in the world that has the internet. And following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones on the floor here at CIGI, or if you're online, you can transmit your questions to the live chat function on your screen, and we'll walk those questions up to our panel. As well, CPAC is covering tonight's event. CPAC is the Cable Public Affairs channel. Our topic tonight is muzzled media, the global challenge. Around the world every year, about 80 journalists are killed in the line of duty. Many more are arrested, jailed, imprisoned for trying to do their jobs. We may take it for granted that we live in a free and democratic society here in Canada, but even in Canada, journalists have been physically attacked, and Canadian journalists have been killed, imprisoned, and otherwise attacked abroad. Short of physical violence, Canadians also run into censorship, threats of jail unless they reveal their sources, the withholding of information that ought to be public, and other vexations that make it harder to report the truth. These may be less dramatic than physical violence, but on the whole, they're far more commonplace, and therefore, on the whole, globally, they represent an even bigger force that muzzles the media. To discuss the challenges and risks and share some of their own stories, we have an excellent panel of first-rate Canadian journalists with experience abroad, and I'll introduce them now. In alphabetical order, and then the moderator. Michelle Shephard is the national security reporter for the Toronto Star and has covered issues of terrorism and civil rights in the decades since 9/11. Her reporting has taken her, among other places, to Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, and 24 times behind the wire in Guantanamo Bay. During her 16 years in journalism, she's won Canada's top 2 newspaper awards, the National Newspaper Award for Investigations and Beats, and the Governor-General's Missioner Award for Public Service Journalism. She's the author of Guantanamo's Child, the untold story of Omar Khadr, published in 2008, and Decade of Fear, Reporting from Terrorism's Gray Zone, to be published this coming September 2011. You can purchase copies of Michelle's book for just over $30. She'll sign those afterwards. Anna Maria Tremonti joined The Current after 2 years as a correspondent and host on CBC TV's flagship investigative program, The Fifth Estate. She spent much of her career roaming the country and the world for the CBC. Between 1991 and 2000, Tremonti filed regular news and documentary reports for CBC television from a rotating cast of international home bases: Berlin, London, Jerusalem, and Washington. She's covered conflict and crisis in more than 30 countries, providing the CBC with eyewitness accounts of the war in Bosnia, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the breakup of the Soviet Union. For her work as a journalist, Tremonti has won 2 Gemini Awards and an Outstanding Achievement Award from Toronto Women in Film and Television. She's also received an honorary doctorate from the University of Windsor, where she completed her undergrad degree. Allan Thompson joined Carleton University's School of Journalism and Communication in 2003 after spending 17 years as a reporter with the Toronto Star. He worked for 10 years as a correspondent on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, reporting on foreign affairs, defense, and immigration issues. And during that time, his reporting assignments took him to such places as Rwanda, Zaire, Sierra Leone, and Kazakhstan. In early 2006, he launched the Rwanda Initiative, a partnership between Carleton's journalism school and its counterpart in Rwanda. He also organized an international symposium at Carleton in 2004 on the role of the media in the Rwanda genocide. He's participated in various training programs for journalists in Rwanda and on 2 occasions in Kenya, the most recent in the aftermath of the 2008 election violence in Kenya. Through the Center for Media and Transitional Societies, a research center he established at Carleton, he heads the Rwanda Initiative Project and a separate research program called Radio Convergence and Development in Africa. And Allan, too, has one of his books on sale here tonight. It's a rare item. It's out of print, and that's The Media and the Rwanda Genocide. Sonia Verma is a reporter for the Globe and Mail, writing for the foreign and national desks. She joined the Globe in the spring of 2009 and has reported from more than a dozen countries for Canadian, American, and British newspapers, including the Times of London and New York Newsday. She was previously based in the Middle East, first in Jerusalem, where she reported on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the war in southern Lebanon, and the rise of Hamas. Most recently, Sonia was based in Dubai, serving as the Times Gulf correspondent, writing from countries such as Saudi Arabia and Yemen. She has also made a half-dozen trips to Afghanistan. Finally, our moderator this evening is Lynn Haddrall, editor-in-chief of Grand River Media, a Metroland media group, part of Torstar Corporation. Lynn is responsible for the editorial departments of 2 daily newspapers, the Waterloo Region Record and the Guelph Mercury, as well as several websites and high-end magazines. Prior to moving to Kitchener, Lynn was editor of the Kingston Whig Standard for 5 years, and her journalism career has taken her across Canada and around the world. Since her arrival at the Record in '99, the newspaper has been nominated several times for the prestigious Missioner Award for Public Service Journalism, winning the award in 2001. The Record has also received the Excellence in Journalism Award from the Canadian Journalism Foundation, National Newspaper Awards, and Ontario Newspaper Awards. Lynn is a graduate of the U of T and Loyalist College. So I now turn things over to Lynn, and please welcome our entire panel.
Thanks, Fred. And welcome everyone to this panel discussion about the challenges journalists face in their work around the world. It's a broad-ranging topic, one that covers everything from working in war-torn countries and places where a free press does not exist, to the seemingly more mundane bureaucratic roadblocks that routinely prevent journalists from accessing important information and data in this country. Some days it feels like our governments, local, provincial, and federal, are ever more inclined to restrict the work of journalists seeking access to public information. It's frustrating that in a world where the transfer of information is a click away, journalists still face huge hurdles getting access to some of that information. They spend years fighting to get it, and they launch legal battles to fight for it on behalf of the public. The Waterloo Region Record spent 3 years to gain access to 500,000 calls for service made to Waterloo Region Police between 2005 and 2008. That started with a simple Freedom of Information request for electronic records. The request was rejected several times. We launched appeals several times. Eventually, we got the information. We've spent 7 years trying to open the door on how much money the City of Waterloo has spent on legal costs for controversial lawsuits launched after a botched finance deal. Their defense has been rejected 4 times now by the Information and Privacy Commission of Ontario and a 3-judge divisional court panel. We're still waiting to get that information. Now, those are battles waged against bureaucracies and in courtrooms. They can result in the release of important information that sheds light on any number of compelling public issues, be it public safety, the health of our communities, or how our tax dollars are spent. But there are no bullets flying, and there is a process that is followed because it's built on the premise that the public does have a right to know. That's not the case in the many places where our esteemed panelists have worked and continue to work. The challenges they face go beyond that bureaucratic red tape. We're going to hear their thoughts and views on the challenges, the risks, and hopefully the rewards of their work in hotspots around the world. We'll open with some introductory remarks from each panelist, and then we'll have a panel discussion, followed by questions from our audience here and online. We plan to wrap up around 9 p.m. I should say 9 p.m. sharp, because we are live streaming. So let's move to opening remarks, and we'll start with Michelle Shephard. Michelle?
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. First, I'd like to say congratulations to all of you, and thanks. Congratulations because I can find my way around Somalia and Yemen, but I had to walk around this building, I think, 5 times before I found the entrance. So consider yourselves all great journalists in that you could get the entrance, which is first step. And then thank you as well for having us tonight, for coming out. This is a really important discussion, one that I think we're having more and more these days. And the reason that we're having it is that really journalism has changed so much. And the golden rule of journalism has been not to become part of the story. I mean, that's what you try and do. But more and more we're having stories about journalists not being able to do their job. There's been quite a few high-profile ones recently of the detainment of New York Times reporters in Libya, the incident in Cairo with a reporter there who was sexually assaulted. And it's funny because those are the stories that we do hear about, but when I travel, usually I'm very humbled by the local reporters that we meet. And unfortunately, we don't hear their stories much, but they're the ones that really face unbelievable harassment and great risks. And I think Allan can talk more about that because he runs a terrific program for journalists in Rwanda. For what I cover national security, and I've been doing it since 9/11, and I started by going down to New York on the night of 9/11 and standing at Ground Zero and looking up at the remains of the World Trade Center and thinking, how did this happen? And it's really been quite an amazing 10-year journey trying to figure that out. And I've been really lucky at the Star that they've allowed me to do that both locally. Canada is a big part of the story. We've had a lot of cases here, a lot of issues of civil rights abuses here, but also they've allowed me to look at it globally. So that has taken me to Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan and some other places. The 2 main challenges that I face on my beat are just the natural security risk of reporting from areas that aren't safe, and also the issue of government secrecy. And I think we were supposed to give sort of a quick personal anecdote, so I'll give a short one of each. In terms of government secrecy, it's really difficult to report in countries such as Yemen where they say that they would like an open press, but they don't really want that, and you face all sorts of restrictions. But probably the most difficult time I've had is Guantanamo Bay. And I've had the privilege, if that's the right word, of going there 23 times now. And I am also one of 4 reporters that the Pentagon expelled from Guantanamo Bay, saying that we had broken a rule there. I won't get into all the details because that could probably take up the rest of the night trying to explain how it happened. But the end result was that the ban was overturned, and we were welcomed back. It created quite an outcry. But trying to get information out there and the restrictions we're under has been a real challenge. In terms of security, I guess the most recent example that I've faced was in February and March. I spent about almost 4 weeks in Yemen reporting on the beginning of the uprising there. It was a really exciting time to be there. And for where I'm at in my career, I find I have to find this balance when I'm reporting from places, especially if I've been there before, between being very cautious and bordering on paranoid, being alert, and becoming complacent. And I think what happened to me in Yemen one day was that I started to become a little bit complacent. And that's actually a risk for journalists, too, when you go to these places. In Yemen, the protest at the beginning took on a bit of a predictable nature. You would have the protesters, the students would start at the university, they'd march through the streets, then they'd clash with their government loyalists called Baltajia. They're which translates basically to street thug. And there'd be these awful clashes where they'd throw rocks at each other and big chunks of concrete. People would get hurt. And then about 12 o'clock, it would wrap up and everyone would go have lunch. And in Yemen, there's a very popular leafy stimulant called khat. And they chew it, and I would say almost 90% of men there chew it. So that's what you do in the afternoon. You chew khat, and you talk. And yes, I did chew khat when I was there, and yes, I did talk. But this one day, I guess I had become rather complacent, thinking about, oh, well, it's almost noon, this should wrap up. And that was the day when the government forces decided to shoot at us. And I was with the student protesters, and all of a sudden, the rocks started, and I thought, okay, well, we'll move to this corner now. And then they started firing, and it wasn't in the air this time, it was live fire at us. And I was very lucky in that I managed to have, sort of see a restaurant off to the side. A very generous restaurant owner let me go in at his own risk, really, because later police did come and talk to him, shut the door, and we were fine. But it was a good lesson for me that, you can become complacent, and you have to remember the risks that are out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Anna Marie.
I'm really pleased to be here tonight. Thank you for coming out to want to be part of this discussion, because I do think it's really important, not only for how we cover events in our own backyards and what happens to people in our own country, but what goes on elsewhere. And I just want to give you a little sense of, I realized, I was thinking back, I went to Bosnia in June of 1992, so that's a very long time ago now. But so much has changed even technologically, and this is part of our challenge, so I'll just give you a little idea. I used to have a satellite phone the size of 2 giant suitcases. I was telling Michelle, I didn't even bring a computer because why bother? It didn't attach to anything. You couldn't actually use it there. And I had this giant satellite phone that you had to kind of set up outside the window. It had a big satellite dish the size of an umbrella. But outside the window, there were snipers, and you could hear stuff going by. And so you put it on a table, and you crawled on the floor toward the window, and you stuck it out there, got out your compass, and made sure it was looking the right way. Then you would string the actual phone apparatus back into the room, preferably the bathroom, because then you could close the door and use a light when you had light. And you could phone Toronto. They didn't even know that I would be sitting on the closed toilet seat talking to them and filing stories, but anyway. And that's how I would call. And I was one of only 2 journalists who had a satellite phone. The other one was Reuters. They charged $40 a minute. We charged $10. And it was an honor system, and people would come and use the phone. And I would always go to the same room. It was in the Holiday Inn. The whole front of it was blasted out. It was in the middle of Sarajevo. It was vulnerable to shelling from the Serbs, and there was stuff always flying through the air. And we would file stories on a broadcast quality line from that telephone. By the time I stopped covering Bosnia, which was late 1994, you could phone on a satellite phone that was the size of a computer. You flip up the top, you don't need the compass, you go. Today, I can reach my friends in Afghanistan on a cell phone better than I can reach people in Toronto. So the technology has changed so much. We can do our research on the internet. We can find people through Facebook and through Twitter and all of this stuff. But the one thing that hasn't changed is you have to find people. And you have to make sure they are who they say they are, and you have to go tell their story. Because the reason we even do this is because we think it's important that we tell you what happens to civilians when their world falls apart. Because they want what we want. They want to raise their kids. They want to give them a nice life. They want to make sure they eat and have something to wear, something on their backs, and then they have a future. Everybody wants the same thing, and that's where we all have the connection. And it was always just, part of the biggest hassle in getting a story is getting there. 90% is the logistics, and then once you're there, making sure you're okay so that you can actually pay attention to them. And the technology has changed, but I think it's important to remember that we are being bombarded with information now. We can collect it, we can move it instantaneously, we can store it. We're not necessarily more knowledgeable. And we have to weed through that. And we used to do that for you, and now you have to do it as well. And so we're all in this together in terms of trying to find the truth. And just on that note, I want to read you something very briefly that somebody wrote to give you an idea of what journalists sometimes face. Some were hit with rubber bullets, some beaten by police. Their cameras were seized, sometimes broken. Film was destroyed. Some were arrested and charged. Several were held in cages for up to 20 hours, denied food, water, and access to legal help. Others were kettled, hemmed in by police for up to 4 hours in pouring rain. One was asked if he was born in Canada. Another had her power wheelchair taken. Those were all journalists covering the G20 in Toronto last year. So just a reminder that we need to be diligent at home as well, that we live in a democracy with a rule of law and a lot of people who actually do respect it. But there is a slippery slope, and as journalists, we have to be diligent even in our own backyards.
Thanks, Anna Maria. Allan.
Again, thank you to everyone for coming. I think it's remarkable that we can fill a room with several hundred people to talk about an issue that a lot of newspaper editors think their readers don't care about. So keep reminding your news organizations that you care intently about the way your world is covered. I'm sort of two things tonight. I am the token male, which is a nice evolution of these types of panels. And I'm sort of an imposter because I was not a foreign correspondent. I didn't live in the countries that I wrote about. I lived in Ottawa, covered foreign affairs, defense, security issues, and did what we called parachute reporting, where I would drop into places where the Toronto Star didn't have someone, but something was happening. And so I became the sort of post-war reporter, where I would parachute into places sort of the day the ceasefire was signed. And so spent a month in Rwanda, a month in Somalia, a month in Sierra Leone. Interesting times, an interesting period, but I've been careful never to sort of portray myself as a foreign correspondent or a war correspondent. My sort of entry point to this broad topic of muzzled media is Rwanda. The place where I have spent the most time. I went there, was fortunate that the Star sent me there in 1996 and again in 1998 to try and figure out the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide. And I had a bit of an epiphany as a journalist being there 2 years after the events of the genocide in realizing I had missed the genocide. I'd missed the events of 1994. I was as oblivious as most people and more or less reconstructed for myself what had happened there, what role did journalists play, what role did the media play. And Rwanda is a textbook example of both sides of the equation of what can go wrong with media in these environments. So Rwandan media, domestic media, were decimated and completely cowed by the regime and contributed to the genocide. And journalists who were functioning, who were allowed to function, engaged in hate media that contributed to the events and to the killing. International media mishandled that story, didn't cover Rwanda very effectively, didn't care, weren't there, got there late, didn't explain things very well. It took us a long time to figure out what was happening. So as a textbook example, Rwanda could teach us a lot about what can go wrong in these environments when it comes to the media. And post-genocide, up to the present day, it's also a very interesting case study in muzzled media. And I say that carefully because this is being broadcast, and I work in Rwanda and work in media capacity building in Rwanda and try to work not with, but alongside a government that has created a very hostile environment for journalists. It is a very difficult place to be a journalist, and one of many very difficult places to work as a journalist. So again, I take from that, what can we learn about what's happening with journalism in these environments? Now, in these discussions, and CBC does these almost annually, I think, where they bring correspondents in to talk about their work in these war zones. And I think the one drawback with that approach is we hear all the time about what it's like to be the Western journalist with lots of resources, lots of training, lots of equipment, almost endless money in some respects, to go there and try and understand someone else's society. And Michelle made a very important point, talking about how humbled you feel in the presence of the journalists who have to live and breathe in the societies that we drop in on, what it's like to be a journalist in those environments. And if I could, I think I would like to narrow my part of the topic toward looking at how we can help journalists who work in these environments to do their jobs better. And certainly we can help them by worrying about free expression and the legal regimes in the countries where they operate, and there's a lot of advocacy in Canada and other places on those issues. I think we can also help them in very, very practical ways by helping them to become better journalists and to be more effective at their jobs, because one of the things that these authoritarian regimes can do is claim that these journalists aren't professional, they aren't trustworthy, they're not doing their jobs effectively, therefore they can't be trusted and we can put them in jail. They don't have credibility. So the Rwanda Initiative project that was mentioned that Carleton has been involved with is all about trying to help build journalism education institutions in Rwanda so that those who make this brave decision to become a journalist in a place like that, in that kind of hostile environment, have a chance to become more effective at doing the job and can be more professional. And Michelle took part in this, was one of those who gave up a month of her life to go to Rwanda and teach in the journalism school at the National University of Rwanda. That's one thing that we can do, I think, to try and improve this situation of journalists who live in this kind of muzzled media environment. I think another thing we can do is pay them to do this job. So a lot of resources go into advocacy, awareness, training exercises. If I had a choice between a $30,000 training conference and hiring 100 journalists at $300 each to do some work for me and find a way to publish it, I think I would do them more good by paying them to do their job. And there's not enough of that. And my former employer, I think, probably spends hundreds of thousands of dollars maintaining the few foreign bureaus that are left. I don't think they spend a fraction of that paying journalists in these environments to do their jobs. Recruit them, give them some training and some guidance and some mentorship if they need it, but find Bosnian journalists and Rwandan journalists and Afghani journalists who can do this job and tell their own stories. So I've got many projects. Another project is to revive an agency called Gemini News Service, which is a news agency, a marketplace for journalists from the developing world to be paid to tell their stories. These are journalists who make between $50 and $500 a month in most cases. To pay them $250 for a story is an amazing contribution to their socioeconomic well-being and to their professional status and self-identity as a journalist. So I think we need to look much more at ways that we can help them to do journalism, not just talk about how awful their situation is. The third thing, I think as journalists, as professionally trained and paid journalists, I think we need to embrace citizen reporters. And a lot of what you're seeing now, for example, from Yemen, from Syria, from Tunisia, sometimes from the fringes in Libya, you're not seeing professional journalists who are taking pictures, capturing video, telling you what's going on in the streets in these hostile environments. You are seeing the product of citizen journalists, ordinary people with no training who happen to have a camera on their phone and captured some video, captured some pictures in a crowd. Increasingly, this is becoming our source of information, and the technology makes that possible. And there's a lot of discussion about the technology. The State Department is now spending a considerable amount to create alternative internet channels so that people who want to communicate from these hostile environments have a way to get information out. People aren't paying very much attention to what's the information that they're gathering. How are they gathering this information? No one is training very effectively citizen reporters. So I call it outcry online training for citizen reporters. We're developing an online curriculum so that citizen reporters, and we'd have to work through intermediaries and channels and identify the people who are doing this, provide them with some basic skills training in capturing video, capturing images, capturing credible information, checking your sources, but most important, not getting killed. As soon as you cross the line from holding your camera up for 30 seconds in a crowd and putting that on YouTube to the next step of actually asking questions, trying to corroborate information, doing the work that a journalist does, you put yourself at considerable risk. And I think if we're going to provide people the tools to do that kind of work, we have to ethically provide them with some training in operating in a hostile environment and how to do this with some degree of safety and security. So my bent would be, let's try and figure out how to improve the journalism in these environments that we're talking about tonight. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Allan. And Sonia, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. I wanted to just say, first of all, what an honor it is to sit at this table with all of these amazing journalists, and also to all of you for coming, to Fred for hiring me at the Toronto Star in 1999. I've almost forgiven him now for not hiring me in 1998. Almost, but not quite. I was in Egypt most recently for the Globe and Mail covering the Arab Spring, and I think that that story is so important in the context of this discussion because I think it has really crystallized things for journalists and also for observers of the media in terms of how media is muzzled. And I really think that it also highlighted a little bit of what Allan and Michelle was talking about earlier in terms of the difference between foreign reporters and I guess, you know, indigenous reporters or local reporters. I flew to Egypt as a foreign correspondent, as a foreign reporter. I managed to get myself arrested and mobbed in the space of 10 days. It's quite remarkable, actually, that I got into so much trouble in so little time. Other journalists were treated the same way. In almost all of these countries, foreign reporters have been identified by the regimes as against the regime, as the people who are inciting violence and inciting revolution. And this, of course, is no coincidence. The regimes are arguing this because they don't want the story of what's actually happening on the ground to get out to people. And I think that they decided to arrest, to detain, to beat up foreign reporters because they perhaps believed that that would prevent the story from getting out. And of course, what we've seen in the Arab Spring more than anything is that they failed to do that because there are all sorts of other people, bloggers, citizen journalists, who have really taken up that space, taken up the task really of telling their own stories to the world. And now with Twitter and Facebook and all of the other sort of social media tools, it's becoming more and more difficult to muzzle those people, the journalists who are telling their own stories. The governments, of course, have realized this in a lot of these countries. That's why you saw Mubarak shut down the internet. That's why you saw Syria do the same, and in a lot of these, other countries following suit. I read a really disturbing statistic on the car ride over here, which was about the types of journalists who are imprisoned right now. And there was a figure from something called the prison census of 145. 69 of those 145 are bloggers. So these are not institutional journalists. These are people who blog, who tweet. And I think that really shows something really significant. It shows how journalism, again, is transferring to citizens more than ever before. And it also shows how effective they are, because they're really freaking some of these states out. I mean, these people are landing them, they're getting arrested, they're getting jailed, they're getting asked to come for coffee by the mukhabarat, and then they're getting, their freedom is taken away. So I think that the most interesting part of this discussion today is where citizen journalists fit into all of this. I don't think it's necessarily us on the podium, per se, as foreign correspondents anymore. I think it's really shifting to actually people who are conducting journalism in a different way and being incredibly brave and also incredibly effective in their own countries. So I'll leave it at that and then open up the discussion.
Thanks, Sonia. So it's interesting. Each of you at some point touched on the evolving form of journalism, whether it's through the technology and how we used to carry suitcases around that were our cell phones, or bloggers who are being imprisoned for being the ones to break the news, citizen journalists. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that and how technology has changed what you do when you're in the field, or what those Indigenous journalists, how it's changed and how you work with them when you're in the country.
Can I,
Yeah.
I'd like to make a point too, because I think citizen journalism is really important. But a lot of countries actually have a really established journalistic establishment. Pakistan, India, tons of amazing journalists. Egypt, they sometimes go to blogging not because they're new age or citizen journalists, but because that was the only place they could actually get anything out under Mubarak. Like, so when we talk about citizen journalists, there are other people using the same tools as citizen journalists who have probably more journalistic experience and in-your-face difficulties than I'll ever have in my life, because they're Pakistani journalists, and the numbers of newspapers and radio stations and TV stations are huge there, even in the sort of the established media. So we also have to help them, and one of the ways we can do that is by hiring them or using them to tell the stories because they know, right? So for me in radio, sometimes it's about getting them on the phone, because they know. Like, when Osama bin Laden was killed, I went to a guy who was one of the best investigative journalists in Pakistan, who still has to be really careful. A very respected investigative journalist in Pakistan was just murdered. He was released from jail, bludgeoned to death. It's believed he was killed by the intelligence service. But this guy said, Osama bin Laden is over 6 feet. The average height of a Pakistani man on this military base is 5'8". You'd think somebody would notice. But like the journalists that are there, sometimes I think we risk seeing everything through the prism of the West. And in terms of the skills they already have, we have to give them a voice, though. And one of the ways we can do it is with this technology, because it allows them to reach us and them to go beyond us. Quite frankly, you don't need us. They are giving you stuff that by the time we figure out we have to get on the plane, we figured it out because we're reading what you're reading.
Which really
So
goes
that's
to what
absolutely
Allan was saying as well.
That's right. That's the challenge always. And and we have a ticket out. They have no ticket out. No matter how good they are, no matter how fearless they are, there's no way out for them. And a lot of them not only risk their lives, they give their lives.
And that's sort of the great secret of foreign correspondence too, is that often we're only as good as the people that we call our fixers. And it's a term in journalism that means when you go into a country, usually if you have the time before you go, you hire someone called a fixer, as the name suggests, fixes almost everything for you, from translation to driving to setting up interviews. And for the experiences that I've had, I think in almost every case but one, that's always been a local journalist. And they're incredible. And so many times you will, the great coup of the interview that a Western reporter is going to get is actually because that fixer has gotten it for you. And I've noticed in some media outlets that now you'll see actually a double byline often with the local reported fixer. New York Times is very good about doing that. And that's an interesting avenue to pursue as well. In terms of the issue of technology, I've become a Twitter addict, and I never thought I would. I was reluctant to get on Facebook, I was reluctant to get on Twitter, and for me, Twitter is kind of the thinking person's Facebook. And I couldn't believe it in Yemen how much I used it as a tool. You think Yemen is one of the most conservative countries in the world, and I'm sure people have a very backwards idea of it. There are lots of people there who are using social media and are on Twitter, and I would use it on my BlackBerry, to the point that I would watch other people tweeting 2 streets away and know that a protest was moving towards me, and I could tweet back. And probably the only bad time was when that incident I talked about, when the shooting was happening. I was in the restaurant tweeting what was happening, you know, and that there was bullets going on the door. And I was hoping my mom wasn't watching my tweets. So that was the only risk of real time. But for me, it's been an amazing, amazing tool.
I know I sort of stuck a shiv into my former employer about how much do they pay journalists to do this kind of work, but it's also not easy as an editor to cultivate. You really have to decide that you are going to do it. If you wanted to cover Africa almost exclusively using the services of African journalists, no one does that. News organizations tend to send our own people because of a sense that, and there's some rationale for that, the sense that, well, I'm going to know what matters to Canadians. I'll have an understanding where what's happening in Rwanda fits into sort of the Canadian whatever. But I still think we lose something. And we should, at a minimum, be doing both. And news organizations, I know foreign desks have Rolodexes of stringers, people who they've used before that are reliable, that they could call upon. But I'm not sure that we systematically seek out journalists who could help us to understand the corners of the world that, you know, as the technology gets better, we contract as a news organization. So there are fewer foreign correspondents with the conventional bureaus. So we should be making better use of these journalists who understand the societies that they're writing about because they live there. They're born there and raised there. But it is a challenge, and I think you have to, again, look at ways of dealing with training issues. Do they have the right training to be able to meet our professional standards, equipment and resources? Although increasingly technology starts to erase some of those barriers. People can, they can do the work and they can get it to you within a day, within a news cycle. We just did this exercise in a class at Carleton. We wanted to try, let's try doing a sort of a news service that was only stories written by African journalists about issues that mattered to them. So we just did a bunch of Google searching and contacted different organizations, came up with a list of about 50 African journalists working, contacted all of them, invited them to talk to my students. They interacted, talked about journalism practices, safety, pay, and then we invited them, well, why don't you pitch us a story? What's the story that you want to do? Pitch it, send it to us, and I had to figure out later where to get the money, but I said, we will pay you $250 for that story. We will publish it on this website that we call GeminiNews.org, sort of a prototype for what this type of a news service could look like. And of course, we got great stories. And we did this in a matter of weeks. So imagine if huge news organizations with tremendous resources systematically made a choice. We're going to cover Africa by cultivating the best cadre of African journalists of any news organization in the industrialized world. And we'll have 50 people telling us what's going on in Africa, not 1 or 2 or 3. And it's a leap to do that, and it would be a major undertaking. But I think it would be, in the end, it would be worth it.
Sonia, I know you're on your Twitter, right?
Yes, I am. I have 4,000 followers.
Yeah.
I think just because I got arrested, actually, before I got arrested. I think I had 12, and 3 of them, you know, was my mother, my father, and my husband. But no, I think that, look, I think there's a big elephant in the room that we're sort of all kind of talking around, not really talking about, and that's that we are no longer the gatekeepers of the news, we being the institutional media. And I agree, with respect, Allan, to everything that everything you're talking about, really. And I think that the online training initiative is incredibly important. But I also think it's important to point out that in a lot of these countries, a lot of the people who are the bloggers, the people that are emerging as like sort of the new journalists, actually don't really consider themselves journalists in the same way that we do. And I don't even know that they would want to self-identify as journalists. And I don't even know that they would want to be sort of singled out as journalists, because first of all, in a lot of cases, that puts them in danger. But second of all, it's just so much easier to tell their stories by just hopping on Twitter or going on Facebook and really just sort of getting those stories out. So while I do think that there is a real concern, again, I completely agree with you, but I think that sort of the actual storytelling that's happening, the way that it's happening and who's doing it, it's really a new model. And the old model of journalism is under economic duress. I mean, we all know it. We all see our bureaus closing. We all see our newsroom budgets shrinking. And we have to find a way of somehow coming to terms with it. I use Twitter, like Michelle, very much as a tool for myself. But I'm also a huge follower of all sorts of bloggers in Egypt and Tunisia and stuff. And I mean, I'm just astonished at how much I learn from them every day. It's like I know these people personally. And in a lot of cases, I mean, it's wonderful for me because I can treat them as sources. I can just, if I land in a country, I can literally say, does someone know a young Egyptian who is a professional by day, a protester by night, please contact me at Sonia Verma. And then I'll get, 10, 15 messages. It's quite amazing.
Did you just say at Sonia Verma so you could get more followers? I don't have 3,000.
Yeah, I was actually comparing all of the followers before. I wasn't going to bring it up.
Yeah.
I'm not sensitive.
Michelle and I follow each other.
Yeah, we do.
We do. Anyways, I think that's what I would just add to the discussion.
Allan, to get back to the concept of training journalists in the countries rather than parachuting in, you've been in Rwanda for how long now with the project there?
5 years.
So do you have a couple success stories, or can you describe someone who came into the program and who's working now, or?
Michelle could probably. Everyone who goes there is frustrated by the local journalism environment, frustrated by the facilities and the infrastructure at the university, and amazed by their students, by the potential of these people who have self-identified, well, I want to be a journalist in this difficult environment.
And the environment, the frustration in the environment is what exactly?
It's a very tightly controlled media environment. And this is partly the legacy of the genocide. The government does not trust the media. I personally think they need to take a chance, or we're just never going to get out of that vicious circle of these constraints. So there are issues that journalists simply will not report on, will not talk about, questions that they won't ask, issues that they won't confront around ethnicity, the military, just taboo subjects. So it's not an open and free media environment. And yet, there are journalists who are good at their jobs, who have tremendous potential, and we've sort of informally tried to cultivate some of those most promising journalists, help them to find some gigs, right, to get paid for their work and to add to their portfolio. So a number of them have been on CBC, they've been on Dispatches, they've been in the Globe, in the Star, in the Citizen, in other papers. And so in some ways, I think that's the success story. I am constantly dealing with donors, right, and trying to explain to people, here's how these funds are leading to these outputs and the results-based management. And it's difficult in that media environment in the space of 5 years to actually be able to demonstrate beyond the anecdotal, here are the results, because it takes a long time. And I think what we're doing is planting a seed. I mean, when I think of there are things I learned 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that I only now realize, or at some point during an assignment, realize I'm using something that I learned either 25 years ago in the classroom or 15, 20 years ago from accomplished editors and others who were coaching and mentoring me. So it's just so valuable to try to formalize journalism education and make it as good as it can be.
Michelle, you were there for a month. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Oh, it was an amazing experience. My husband's at the Toronto Star as well, and so he had a small class that he taught photography, and I had a larger class with another teacher that we did sort of basic reporting. And as Allan said, I mean, the students are incredible, and again, you're just humbled because, you know, you say you're of the same profession, but journalism in other countries is such a different, it's a different profession. The risks are so great. So one of the ethical dilemmas I had, and we sort of talked about this, and the other instructors have talked about, is, you know, you want to push them as far as you can, but you do go in with the mentality as a Western journalist. So you would have sort of mock press conferences, and you would, you know, push them to ask any question that, you know, and push hard. And then you have to always remember, well, this isn't the environment that they're working in. And unfortunately, recently, there's been, you know, some fatalities of journalists. So it's an amazing project, and I'm, you know, I do get down when I hear that funding is often an issue for it, because it's a really, really important project.
I mean, I told one class in Rwanda about, and I couched it by saying, now, I don't know the Rwandan media culture well enough, so I'm telling you how it works in Canada. And there was this time I was trying to scrum the Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, and he didn't like my questions, and I kept asking, and I wouldn't get out of his way, and we had a physical altercation. He grabbed me and twisted my arm and pushed me out of the way.
Chrétien grabbed you?
Yeah.
I don't remember this story.
And the journalists were just astounded, like, oh my God, what happened? Like, what happened? I said, well, the next day there was a press conference, and I was the first one that he asked to take a question, because now he recognized me, he knew who I was. So it was a positive for me that I'd had that physical confrontation, so that wouldn't happen in Rwanda.
You're lucky he didn't use a sculpture on you.
Yeah.
Getting the story under those kind of situations, whether you're a Western journalist or whether you're a journalist there trying to get the story. I mean, we talked about frustration, we talk about how hard journalists work to get it. Is there ever a point that each of you got, and maybe when you know, Sonia and Michelle more recently on the ground, you question the value of it and if it's worth it? And I think back to a conference I was at where Ian Stewart, who was a bureau chief with the Associated Press, and I knew Ian from Queen's University. He was working in Sierra Leone and was shot in the head. The photographer who was with him was actually killed. And I was taken by his initial reaction when he started talking about it and whether the story was worth it. He's gone on to write a book about his experiences, but I just wonder, maybe share a little bit of your personal experiences when you've been in those situations. And I know you're getting feedback, instant feedback from Facebook and from Twitter, but do you see the stories played well here? Do you think they're getting the kind of play they deserve? Are we getting it here?
I mean, I think that for me, and I think Michelle would agree, I mean, there's no story that's worth dying for. We all agree on that. There's no story that's worth jeopardizing. And so I think you constantly ask yourself that question: is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? I ask myself that question about 10 times every day when I'm in these places, you know, because you have to. And also, you know, it's not just about taking risks yourself. You're working with fixers, you're working with photographers, so you're also, you know, I mean, you're bringing these people along, and so you're putting these other people at risk. And, you know, we've seen instances where, again, a lot of, you know, I mean, journalist photographers, a colleague of mine, Stephen Farrell, who I worked with in Jerusalem, was kidnapped in Afghanistan, and he was rescued along with his fixer, Mr. Munadi, Sultan Munadi. And, you know, British paratroopers dropped in to rescue them, and Sultan was killed in that process of rescue. That was a very upsetting story for a lot of us, I think, because, you know, having worked in Afghanistan, you know how easy it is, really, to sort of, where things can change in an instant, and how you have absolutely no control over those things. And suddenly, you're no longer, you know, trying to get an interview with some Taliban fighter. You're trying to, you know, to save your life. And always there's that uneven reality. Again, foreign journalist versus, you know, the Afghan journalist. So I think we ask ourselves those questions a lot of times. But I think that, for myself anyways, I mean, I'm drawn to do this kind of work because I really, really believe that these are important stories, and I really, really believe that they need to be told. So, you know, that's why I like to go to these places. I mean, it's not, I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't like, getting shot at. I don't sort of rush towards, danger because, because I like it. I think it's really important. And so it's like sort of that sort of passion that I think drives a lot of the correspondents that I know.
Mm-hmm. Michelle? I guess we often talk about sort of the risk-return ratio, and I try and do that for every story and make sure that your ego's in check. Are you doing it? Are you taking these risks because this is a story that can make a difference, that you can actually tell well, or are you sort of going for that next high? And I don't consider myself an adrenaline junkie either. It's a good point that Sonia made, but a lot of journalists don't talk about that. There is an addiction to it. There is a high that you get. And in some ways, when you're in these places, we were talking about this at dinner, it might sound strange, but life is actually easy when you're there. All you have to do is think about getting the story out and keeping yourself safe. And people at home are saying, oh, doing well, keep going, great. You don't sleep, you just sort of go on the adrenaline for the time you're there. And then you come back, and not that I have a hard life, I'm very lucky, I have a great life here. But there's an adjustment period, because then all of a sudden you're doing the laundry and you're taking the garbage out, and you lose sort of that addiction. So I think there's always that risk-return ratio. For me, the story of Somalia has always been heartbreaking, and one I do get a little bit cynical about, because it is one of those countries I feel nobody cares about. It's an incredibly complicated country, and there's no easy answers, but I feel because of that we've sort of ignored it. So the first time I went there in 2006, going into Mogadishu is not easy. I'm lucky that I worked for the Toronto Star. We paid security, we paid fixer, I had a convoy, and at that time I think there was a small glimmer of hope in Somalia for what could have been peace. I won't say peace, what could have stopped the anarchy for a period. And I just felt the stories that you wrote didn't make a difference, because what people had warned would happen did happen. And so, it's hard not to get cynical. And you think, well, why we're doing this, you want to make a difference, or I do anyway. So,
Anna Maria, when you were in the field, did you have thoughts on the...
I agree that I'm not an adrenaline junkie at all. I'm a chicken. But, at some point, it just becomes important to be there. And so you go back, and whatever you go through, they go through more. And, what we were talking about even now, journalism, what we're talking about are citizenry, like people who are so helpless that finally when they do rise up, like they did in Egypt, like they want accountability, and they want, so, whatever you go through, they go through worse. And that kind of makes you stop and take a step back. But yeah, I think that I think we all talk about calculated risk, and it's a calculated risk till it's a bad risk, and you don't know till you don't know till you know. And but that's not what anybody's going to tell anybody back home. And but I do think that and we all say we wouldn't risk our lives for it, or no story is worth your life, but you don't know that. As soon as you go there, all bets are off. As there's a randomness. And I would say the thing I understood about war was not about my coverage of war, but it was just about humanity. People who have nothing will give you everything. People in total trauma are the ones who are going to be the most open and the most willing to help you, even though they're the ones in trauma. And people will risk a lot of things for things we take for granted and don't even hold, things that we say. We say we are a country of democracy, we say we're a country of open government. And then when we ask our government a question and they refuse to answer, we go, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Gosh, all we have to do is ask again. And, maybe Jean Chrétien will grab you by the throat. But that's the shame of it. Sometimes in our own country, we don't hold our own politicians' feet to the fire. We don't demand of them what we expect other people to demand of their governments with far greater circumstances, for greater consequences. But there's a randomness, too, that you learn to understand, that there's a randomness to everybody's life. I'll never forget meeting, a little boy. He's in a makeshift hospital. It's not even a hospital. They have candles. They have no lights. And he's whimpering. He's literally whimpering like a puppy. And, you know, it's a classic story that there's shelling and shooting, and it goes on for days, and mom won't let him out of the house, and then finally 6 hours of quiet, you know, and they, please, please, let me go out with my cousin. So they go out, bang, you know, a mortar shell comes in, kills the cousin, sticks shrapnel in his brain, and it's all done, you know, and I go through and I don't have a scratch on me. It's sort of the wider issue of life that you get through the stories we tell, you know, and that's part of our journalism as well. But the other part is holding everyone to account. People who are elected, appointed, people who have influence or power by virtue of their corporate weight, whether they be in Egypt or somewhere else. And again, I'm not going to equate what goes on in this country to that. But I will say that we have the same obligations back home. And we chicken out. We don't ask our politicians tough questions. And you know, you saw an entire citizenry in Egypt rise up and say to Hosni Mubarak, you know, in Bas Halas, which means like enough already in Arabic, you know, like, we're not putting up with this anymore, and they won. We don't know where they're going, but he's not there. And we don't know what kind of tyranny is able to replace him. But I mean, that is the, you know, when we talk about citizen journalism and journalism, we also just have to talk about citizens who care. Mm-hmm. Because without the regular folk on the ground, that wouldn't have happened at all. And it's breathtaking. And it's a real lesson to all of us that we, you know, if they can do that, we could at least vote.
Yeah.
Or not riot at hockey games.
I thought we might talk about hockey. Certainly lots of editorials that made comparisons to why people protest around the world. I guess here it's when we don't win a hockey game. I think just one more question from me, maybe, then I'm going to open it up to our audience members. But in my role as an editor, I'm contacted quite a bit by young, aspiring journalists, young men and women who are in journalism school or who want to become a journalist. And sometimes they talk about how they want to be foreign correspondents, that's their end game, that they see it as kind of a glamorous lifestyle and a little bit exotic. And I'm just wondering, I know with the technology now, maybe you get questions from some of them, but and I think there's a couple in the room tonight, but maybe some advice on how you got where you are, and also how do you prep when you go, yeah, and you teach lots of those students.
Well, my first piece of advice is buy a plane ticket and go. Mm-hmm. Like I just...
with no prep?
Oh no, you prep, but I've put a lot of energy at Carleton into finding strategies to send young journalists and journalism students to Africa. Mm-hmm. It's just like a catapult approach. Wind it up, get them on, send them over. And we've had 100 journalism students go to Rwanda and now other Uganda, Kenya, Sierra Leone, because I just think journalism is, we can no longer assume that if you're going to work as a journalist, you're going to work in Canada. Or even that you will reach that glorified, almost mythical state of being the foreign correspondent, because those jobs are now so few and far between. But you may well work in Southeast Asia at an economics magazine or at an online publication. So I strongly encourage people, and then I have to convince their parents who call me, hey, if you're in your graduating year, I will find some funding, we'll arrange some scholarships, I'll facilitate you going to Rwanda and working at a radio station for 2 months, because it's just, there's no better life experience as a journalist, as a young human being, as someone who's trying to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their life. So I know that we all, I mean, I had this sort of star in my eyes notion of becoming a foreign correspondent. A lot of people go into journalism because that's part of the myth of the profession. I tell people, be realistic about those jobs, but yes, get on a plane and go and do it and have that life experience. Because if you're going to wait for your media employer to send you, you might be waiting a long time. So if you have an opportunity to get that experience, do it.
Mm-hmm. I think some of the larger media companies, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're going, they walk you through a bit of a boot camp in terms of the security, do they not? I think the Star brought in a security agency once to do some briefings, and I don't know if the Globe does the same.
CBC has, we're required to have hostile environments training every 3 years. Without it, you cannot go to a list of countries, including I was going to Jerusalem a couple of years ago for the Current to do a water series. I wasn't there to do conflict. And I said, come on, I used to throw dinner parties in Jerusalem. You know, I don't need hostile environments. But we have a very strict corporate rule. We're a Crown Corporation, and it's actually a government rule. I think almost every news organization now does some kind of training to figure out how to be safe, and also combat first aid. Mm-hmm. If you are injured or your colleagues are injured, you got the first 10 minutes are very serious in how you might help them to get help. And again, you know, they can sometimes be airlifted. It depends on if you're traveling with soldiers too, obviously, but or an army that's equipped. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we have training. We have to have it, or we can't get on that plane.
We have varying degrees. I was lucky that I did the hostile environment training. Not everybody who goes has that now, but we have other levels. So I went in 2005, and what it is, basically, there's various companies that do it. Mine was with a company called Centurion, and it's real. Did you go to it?
No, there were some people that went.
It's quite the week. It's really, really tough. British Marines who I think loved the opportunity to beat up journalists for a week. Mm-hmm. So they make it as realistic as possible, and you're out in a field in Virginia, and they kidnap you, and they videotape it so you can see what that's like. You can actually learn how to be a good hostage. And then probably what what I liked most was the combat first aid, and they do really realistic scenarios. I remember after that week, I was so exhausted, and going to the airport, and I still had the fake blood on my cargo pants, and my hair was almost dreads, and so I had it in braids, and I fell asleep at the gate, and Air Canada was yelling my name, and I just remember running onto the flight last minute, and I thought every passenger on that flight looked up and went, they thought that a deranged Pippi Longstockings was about to hijack the flight. But anyway, there are actually a few times when what I learned there, I think, has helped in the field.
Sonia, what about you?
Well, I think that I get asked the question quite a bit, actually, and I have sort of standard advice that I get. I think it's the best job in the world. I honestly do. I just think we're so lucky to be able to go to these places, and I just think it's such a privilege. You learn so much. It's kind of, it's a job where the learning never stops. It's so amazing in that way. But I'm very conscious of the fact that when I talk to students starting out, most people don't come from privileged backgrounds where they can just sort of finance their own sort of forays into foreign corresponding. And also, a lot of people aren't interested in sort of doing the kind of bang war stuff. And that's okay. There's other types of stories to cover in this world. It's a big place. There's lots of places where there are valuable and important stories to tell. In terms of the finances of it, you have to go somewhere where you're able to support yourself, and you're not going to be able to support yourself starting out freelancing. You're just not. You have to be flexible. You have to be able to. You have to be willing to teach English. You have to be willing to, to do corporate work a little bit. Maybe do some work for some of the NGOs. There's, because news organizations are shrinking, and I'm at the Globe. The Globe is still very committed to foreign news, and I'm, again, so lucky to be there because we're actually opening bureaus as opposed to closing them. It's the exception rather than the rule. The result of these larger news organizations pulling back is there's more opportunity for freelancers. Because then you can sort of, the Globe, for example, right now doesn't have someone in Cairo. What an interesting story is happening in Cairo right now. So, and the other thing about Canada, which is amazing, is that there's so many people who speak other languages anyways. So imagine being an Arabic speaker just fresh out of J school, you know, where else would you want to be right now? I'm sorry, but, you know, just sort of, you know, get yourself there, get yourself set up, and do what you want to do. I didn't go to journalism school, and I didn't even graduate from McGill in the end. But I think that this is the kind of thing where there's no, I mean, you need to do it. You just need to have the experience, and that's how you learn.
And I would agree with that. I think that curiosity is the most important thing you need, and some tenacity. And you have to remember your first job is not your last job, so get in there, whether it's at home, because Sonia's absolutely right. There are lots, not everybody aspires to do that, and there are lots of great journalistic jobs to aspire to, but get in, and once you're in, figure out what works for you, and then, you know, maneuver, figure it out, be curious even in your workplace, but, or if you're freelancing or whatever, but I agree, it's a fantastic way to see the world and to understand people. It's a real privilege. But just barge in.
Because the news right now in Yemen is basically being told by about three stringers, three freelancers who are Arabic students, and they've made names for themselves in journalism because it's so difficult to get a visa there. That when I was there were only four foreign correspondents that were there in the country at that time. And now I think there's only maybe 2. But these 3, there were actually 6 of them, but the government deported 3 of them. These 3 journalists were Arabic students. 2 were Arabic students, 1 was working for the local paper. And they've been stringing for the New York Times, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and sometimes, you know, all 3 at once. So they've made names for themselves because they were in Yemen ahead of time. And it's terrific. They've got a great future.
Now, where are your students finding, the ones that are hopping on the plane and going? I know Rwanda is probably one destination, but where else are they finding work?
Well, the program I was talking about, we're funding them, we're sending them. On placements, on internships, but a significant number stay once they're there. We've had more than several students who've done their 2 months in Rwanda and have stayed. One still there, one went back, several others stayed for 6 months, a year, longer, or have now, based on that experience, have gone somewhere else in Africa. Another one's working in Botswana, another went to Sierra Leone. So again, I just think that opportunity to get that exposure, and you know, I keep coming back to my own kind of epiphany with Rwanda and realizing I'm a trained journalist and worked for a national newspaper and didn't realize the significance of that story in 1994. And a lot of editors were in the same position because they had no idea where the place was, had no exposure, no previous experience, nothing to kind of fall back on. So I think there's just enormous value in young journalists getting into these environments, getting that life experience, and getting an aptitude for that kind of reporting. Another thing I stress when people are trying to figure out how could I go abroad and make a go of this, I tell them, don't just think that the only reason you would go abroad is to go to a war zone. Like, there's a bit more going on in the world than conflict. I know sometimes it seems like that's all that's happening, but there's an entire world out there, and people are living their lives, they're going to work, they're doing their jobs, they're trying to make money, they're starting businesses, they're listening to music. Like, the most underreported story from Africa is the music scene. I mean, it's mind-boggling. The music scene in Africa and the cultural creativeness. We know nothing about it. So I tell people, look for those stories. Go and find those interesting stories that aren't about conflict and mayhem and famine. They're still very real. I'm not telling them go and look for cheerful, chirpy, good news stories. Yeah. It's just go look for reality, and music and business and sports are 3 areas that we cover intensely in our own domestic media, and we barely cover it at all when we go, even in these hostile environments. It's quite interesting to find out what are people doing with the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Sonia, I just want to loop back to you on one point, and as we're doing that, perhaps if you have a question, you can make your way to one of the 2 mics that are set up. Sonia, I just wanted to close the loop on the prep when you are going into a conflict zone. And we heard from CBC and STAR. What kind of prep did you have for your first assignment? Did you feel that you had the prep that you needed?
Yeah, I've never felt that. I mean, look, I mean, I think that I've done a hostile environment training course as well, and I think my first assignment, I think, was actually, I don't even remember my first assignment. I think it was actually going to India, and it wasn't sort of a conflict kind of situation. But you know, I mean, I'll tell you, like 90% of, I mean, at the moment right now, I'm based here in Toronto, and I parachute in, okay? And I'll tell you, like 90% of my assignments, it's like, you know, I'll get a call at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'll be at my daughter's ballet class, and they'll be like, you know, you need to go to Cairo now, and I'll be on a plane. But you know, you can prepare only so much, I think, for some of these, for that kind of job. And I also think that the one thing I see with the young students is I think some of them almost overthink or over-prepare, and I know that might sound a little bit weird, but you know, you do at some point just have to go, and you know, things will work themselves out generally. I think that a lot of students sort of say, well, you know, there's 17 books that I've read, but there's one book that I still have to read before I go. Or, you know, I met this guy recently at a conference, and he said that he was going to go. He was going to go to Uganda, and I said, great. And you know, and he said, I'm just wondering what I should do before. And I was like, well, what have you done so far? And he talked to me for about 25 minutes, you know. I mean, he had already lined up, you know, he had already met with editors, he had his own website dedicated, he had, you know, I mean, he had like a project that he just sold to The Guardian. I mean, it was quite amazing. And so I think, you know, in terms of preparation, yes, you need to prepare in terms of the security, hostile environment stuff, the first aid, which is absolutely essential. But, you know, don't over-prepare as well. Just go and be open. I think sometimes you can almost feel like you know too much going into some of these places, whereas really your job there is to, I mean, some of the best journalists go there with a lot of questions. I think that's the important part.
Well, that gets back to what Anna Maria was saying about the curiosity and what Allan was saying about just get on the plane.
Well, there's something else that goes on with this. I'll just raise this. A lot of major news organizations now not only get hostile environments training, they work with former military people in the field about staying safe once they're there. And that can be a very good thing when you're in a place that where all hell is breaking loose. There is a danger that we start to see all these stories through the prism of the military. And that's not to say anything against the fact, I know we have soldiers in Afghanistan, and I believe no matter what people think about war, when you have soldiers fighting in your name, you document what they're doing and what happens to them. But the real story of war is what happens to civilians. And there's a danger when you're so worried about what's going to happen to you in your hostile environment that you forget you're really there to talk to the people who are actually living in the middle of it. And you know, some of the best reporting I've ever seen, there was a woman who worked for The Guardian in the 90s named Maggie O'Kane. She wore a little flowered dress, and she slung her computer and a water bottle over her shoulder, and she'd get on a bus with refugees, and she'd be on that bus for 6 hours. And she'd get off the bus, and she'd win every big award the British had. And you know, this was before, I mean, that's when we started hostile environments training because so many people were getting shot and killed. But you know, there's a danger in going too close to that because the military has a job. It's not our job. And we really do have to take it, you know, we need to see it through the prism of the people who live there as opposed to the prism of what we expect it to be or what our governments expect it to be. And I think all of that is something that we have to weigh. And I agree. I mean, you're there to see you're there to report on what the people feel. So forget the book. Background is good, trust me. But yeah, talk to them. Ask them what they think, and they will tell you. I mean,
just one more thing along those lines that I would add. I also think that a lot of journalists starting out, you know, they look at the Canadian Embassy webs. You know, they contact the Canadian Embassy, and I can tell you, like, literally, it's like I called the Canadian Embassy once. I think I was in Gaza or something like that, and it was during some of the fighting, because I was stuck at the border. I was stuck at Erez. I couldn't get out. So I called the Canadian Embassy and I said, you know, can you help me get out? They're sort of, you know, detaining me yet again. And they said, well, our travel advisory says not to travel to Gaza. Haven't you seen our website? And I just think that sort of there are these other mentalities out there, and you have to understand that as a journalist, you are not an NGO, you are not part of the government, you are not part of the military, you're really doing something different. So yes, rely on ask the questions, read those travel advisories, but don't necessarily heed them all of the time. Oh, Libya, I wanted to make one last point.
Okay.
Something I'm seeing very alarming and very scary is a lot of young journalists rushing to Libya. And it really worries me because a lot of them don't have the hostile environment training. They see a big story happening and they're running to Libya and they're getting in trouble. And so, that is not an ideal situation for a seasoned journalist. It's not an ideal situation at all for someone starting out.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to move to questions from the audience. If I could ask you to move to the mic, we'll take our first one over here. Please state your name and ask your question.
Yeah, my name is Brian, and they said to mention our affiliation. It's just the Living Room Debaters. Lynn, I wanted to come back to you on your opening about how you were throttled getting freedom of information. And Anna Maria, you read a statement from the G20. And Allan, you shared your story about the Pierre or the Chrétien and the questioning. I'm just wondering why we're throttled so much here in Canada, I guess, in terms of journalism, questioning. We've been through, you can ask 5 questions. We've been through many, many things out in our own country where we have not heard a lot of questions or a lot of answers. If you could just speak to that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
Can
Allan?
I jump in? Only because I've actually been thinking about this quite a bit, because almost a decade ago, I worked for a decade as a political reporter. So I was sort of there really in another era, so I'm a bit of a dinosaur. It was the Chrétien era. Then I started teaching journalism. So now I'm supposed to be reflecting on journalism and looking at what's going on in the profession. And and Anna Maria mentioned this, I mean, accountability and holding our own leaders to account. It's just driven me to distraction watching what's been going on. And, I don't want to seem too political, but the ability of the Harper government, pre-election and post-election, to manipulate and control and contain media. And I've been reluctant to kind of weigh in on it and write about it and be seen as a commentator or pontificator about it, because inevitably you start criticizing former colleagues for their work and their story and how they interacted with a politician. And I'm not there on a day-by-day basis, but just watching it from, a mile down the road at Carleton, I think there's just been an astounding change in our own political dynamic of the interaction between journalists and politicians. And I think, from what I can see from afar, I think it has been driven by a government that has decided this is the way we are going to foster, this is the media environment that we want. And they have gone out to create that environment and curtailed media access to cabinet, ministers coming out of cabinet. That used to be routine. We would go, and what it meant was, I know it might look like gibberish on TV with questions and things being, but what it meant was once a week, we had a crack at every minister of the Crown and the Prime Minister. And if they didn't want to answer our questions, they had to be seen running away from us down the hall as we shouted and chased at them. So it was messy, but as an accountability mechanism, I think it was a very important institution. And by caveat, that was removed, that was eliminated. And there was protest in the gallery, and there were discussions how to respond to this, but ultimately the government won and curtailed. That's just one example, one very important avenue of media scrutiny and accountability. And there are several others. So I agree with you. I think it's troubling. I think journalists are partly to blame because we don't work as a group. We all work for different organizations. It's a competitive industry. So how to respond to this, how to deal with it. And so far, I think the Harper government has won the battle to now and has got the media environment that they want.
I think Anna Maria wants to jump in.
What I read to you earlier, by the way, was I sit on the board of the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, CJFE.org. You know, CJFE is the also oversees what's called IFEX, which is an international free exchange site with 85 countries on it, organizations like our own. And if you go to ifex.org, you will read today, you know, 7 different things about journalists in peril. But, you know, over the last several years that I've been on this board, we have actually had to turn our attention more to journalists in Canada as well, in terms of our court fights, in terms of fights like the G20, in terms of access to expression. And, you know, we have a journalist in Canada who was murdered for covering a story. His name is Tara Singh Hayer. He was covering Air India stuff. No one has ever been charged in his murder. So there is stuff going on here. And when it comes to our governments, what I have observed, because we were in Ottawa around the same time, increasingly, and it isn't even one political party, I will say that right out. Every government has progressively made themselves more difficult to get to. At the current, we have a request count that we used to go to air with. We still keep it on our site. In Season 8 of the current, which was last year, we put in 102 requests to cabinet ministers. We got 87 no's and 5 yeses. The ministers who never came on, the health minister, Minister Glukuk, foreign affairs minister, Minister Cannon, the defense minister, we're a country at war, the public safety minister. You know, I mean, I'm not that tough. The idea that government ministers don't feel a need to speak to, and it's not that I'm so great, I do have I have a big audience, and you'd think that they want to reach it, but the point is that there's no feeling of a need to be held accountable. And this goes on in the corporate world too. People will shut you down with media and PR, and it's important that we ask. I say to my producers, there's more than one way to cover a government. If the minister isn't going to speak to you, someone else will. There's another way to find out, but it becomes more and more difficult, and we deserve better. You know, part of a democracy is the ability to hold those who have power over us and make decisions to account, or at least ask them why they did what they did. They have an obligation to tell us. And I think it's very serious, and I think there's serious journalism to do right here. A lot of journalism students right now are freaking out because we keep telling them that our media is crunching down and there are no jobs and it's not a good business to get in. I say there's never been a better time. We need you, and we are getting soft. I'll say it. Politically, as journalists, we should be asking tougher questions, and that includes the people who follow. Mm-hmm.
I think we'll move on to another question from this mic over here.
Hi, I'm Tennille Bonagor, formerly of the Globe and Mail, now with Alternatives Journal. Following on pretty much from what you were just saying, traditional media is being crunched. There are cuts to budgets. In light of that, I mean, governments and those in power are being increasingly hostile, either through violent means or through making it more difficult to access information. Do you see a possible danger of the media muzzling itself through a lack of resources?
Yes.
So who would like to field that one? Sonia?
As the Twitter illiterate, let me, which is an awful thing to admit as a journalism professor, but I don't use Twitter. I keep deciding I need to do this, and I don't use it effectively or barely at all. But one thing, again, the advantage of having been somewhere in another era and then now looking at it from a distance, what I notice is I think people are so busy feeding the goat, essentially, tweeting, filing to the web, doing instantaneous observation, it's important. It's like a whole new, it's like we need 3 people out there at the same time. Right. I mean, I used to be just an old-fashioned print journalist. Every now and then, I had to take my own pictures. And I found that to be quite difficult and had such respect for Michelle's partner as a guy who takes pictures and writes. I found that to be so difficult. I can't observe, I can't take note, I can't report and get what I need because I've got to worry about taking these pictures. So imagine, but all I had to do was do all my interviews, spend all day long out in the field, and then go back and write my story and file it, and it appeared in the next day's newspaper. It was so simple and easy, and it was sometimes 1,000 words, 1,500 words, 2,000, like sometimes quite long, thoughtful, I hope, analytical pieces. I can't imagine doing that if I also had to share my observations, you know, every half hour, every hour, and it's valuable, but I think what it has done, it's changed the dynamic so much of reporting, and yet there's a demand for it. News organizations want reporters to do it because this is what audiences want to consume. But how can you do all that and still do thoughtful, analytical, and still have the time to think of these questions that we should be asking and not just take the first answer and move on?
Can I interject? You take your journalism back. I don't think that we can blame, you know, when you've been in the business 20 years, you can't blame your boss if you're not the journalist you wanted to be. We are only as good as the journalists we want to be. And, you know, I have always worked in the broadcast industry. I've always had terrible deadlines. And sometimes I said no. I mean, there was a time when they couldn't find me. Now they can find you anywhere. And sometimes you have to file a lot. But we also, I say this to my fellow journalists at CBC, and my bosses don't necessarily like it. Take your journalism back. No one can make you stand in front of a camera every hour on the hour and say nothing. Only you can do that. So you either say to the desk, no, I'm not available in the next hour because I'm getting a story. Fight them. I mean, you know, if you're going to be so tough that you're going to ask a tough question, the reason you get hired as a journalist is because you're brave enough and cheeky enough to ask the questions that need asking. So push back. Take your journalism back even from your bosses. And I would go as far as to say to the people who run news organizations and say we have no money, maybe their management system is wrong. Maybe the new generation coming up will find a better way to do it. Journalism isn't dead. We're going to find a way. We have technology to use as a tool, but no one can make us stupid. And the technology doesn't make us stupid. People can use, you just heard here tonight, people tweeting in order to find those big stories that they will then spend time crafting and writing. So take your journalism back. And when the boss says, I want you to do this story, you go, well, okay, but I'm doing this one too. And, you know, like, trust me, eventually it'll work.
Well, I don't know where you work, Anna Maria, but
I'm trouble.
Yeah, no, I do agree that I think there's probably no. Right now, it's a really important time to have that conversation, because when we do talk about citizen journalism, and everything is so fast, and there is times when you're in the field and you feel like the monkey with the tambourine because you're doing so much. I mean, you're working 18-hour days because you are feeding the beast. You're updating the web. You are doing Twitter. I do my own photos now as well. So it can be overwhelming. And I think what we need really to survive is we need to differentiate ourselves from those people who are doing the quick tweets and the blogs. The bloggers are just riffing off what we do. I mean, I always say this, I've never seen a blogger with me in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, they're just back in Washington writing off of the articles, the original content that we give them. So I think, you know, as what they call now mainstream media, we have a responsibility to do that even better, to be more thoughtful, to give more context, because we're the ones that have the resources to do that. So I agree. I can't say that argument always works, but I think the more we do it, and probably those of us who have been around a little bit longer, we're the ones who can do that, because when you're trying to get a job in journalism now, I know at our paper anyway, I mean, it's really valued how many different things you can do. So, you know, you do have to do a little bit of everything, but I think it's up to us to push back, so it's a good point. Sonia?
I'm going to disagree with some of the panelists. You know, I think that, you know, I mean, the internet is here, you know, it's like the wheel, like the jet plane. You know, we're not going back in time. I mean, we have to embrace these technologies. We can't be afraid of them. We can't look at them as as demands, as things that are just like, oh, you know, God, another thing that we have to do, another thing. We have to use them as resources. We have to incorporate them into our journalism. And this, you know, may sound extremely abstract, and I can completely relate to the things that, you know, that the other panelists are talking about in terms of like, oh my gosh, you know, I've got to tweet, I've got to shoot video, I've got to file it. But, you know, at the same time, it's like, it's really not that hard to tweet. Like, it's, you know, I mean, you know, in a cab, how many hours have all of us spent in cabs in terrible places? How many times, you know, looking out the window, talking to your cab driver, you know, I mean, just like, you know, 140 characters and send it. And then, you know, that really, I think, adds a lot to people's understanding of what's going on. And it creates a conversation. And this is the thing that I think is the most amazing about all of these technologies, is that it's collaborative. It's no longer, you know, and it's kind of great that it's no longer just me with my notebook going out and talking to 7 people and then going back to my hotel room and then, like, you know, just really having nervous breakdown about some 2,000-word piece in silence, you know, and then sending it out to the office in Toronto, and then it's published, you know. I mean, I can think about an idea, I can develop context in a much more effective way now that I have these tools. I can talk to people who have interviewed other people. I can reach people via Twitter, via Facebook, you know, in an instant at another corner of the city, and I can incorporate all of this stuff. You know, I think that there's also a new kind of journalist that's emerging, which, you know, someone like Andrew Carvin at NPR, who essentially has been really informing all of our conversation and our understanding of the Middle East from Washington. You know, he's sitting there and he backpacked through Tunisia, I think, once or twice and had a few contacts. He's become an absolute expert on the story of the Arab Spring because he has cultivated sources. He has had conversations with people all throughout the region. And, you know, what he does is of value. It's not a distraction from journalism. Rather, it is journalism. You know, I think we have to sort of be a little bit more open-minded about these new demands and look at them as opportunities a little bit. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, we're going to go for another question from the floor. Your name, please?
My name is Cliff Lonsdale. I've been a lifelong journalist, and I teach journalism at Weston. I'm also the president of something called the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma. And I want to pull together a couple of thoughts that came up in the earlier discussion. And I thank you to Sonia for urging young reporters not to run off to Libya without any training. We're talking about hazardous environment training that many of the panelists have been on. And at the same time, we're talking about the way in which the news media are now relying much more on freelancers, whether those are Indigenous or quite often young students who head off from Canada to do things. The forum has been trying to launch, and will be launching in a few weeks, in a very small way, a pilot project to try to help send some of those freelancers on the same hazardous environment training program that the staff correspondents have been sent on. We've spent a lot of time trying to persuade Canadian media organizations that this is somehow their collective duty to contribute to a fund that then will at least pick out some of the most deserving cases and help them. So far, we've got 3 organizations on board, most notably the CBC. Many others have said no to us. And I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts from the panel on our kind of collective responsibility for not downloading the safety issues onto the people who can least afford to bear them.
Okay.
It's come up. I teach a course at Carleton on journalism and conflict, which deals with a whole bunch of different issues. It's not like a course on being a war correspondent. It's looking at all these issues that touch on when journalists and conflict meet. And one thing that's become clear to me, and I'm glad you're here so we can talk afterward, is there's a real appetite among these journalism students to find out more about the impact of trauma on them, if they're in these environments, on the people they're interviewing. And the amount of training that could be done, it's not in anybody's journalism school curriculum, as far as I can tell. There is no course on journalism and trauma taught in Canada. I'm not sure if there's one, maybe one place in the US. I would like at least to dedicate a good part of this course on journalism and conflict to those issues around prepping yourself for dealing in these environments. But it's not just protecting yourself. It's the impact of trauma on the people you're interviewing, the ethical responsibility of interviewing people who are in shock and don't realize even what they're saying to you. They may all be great quotes and good color, but what's the impact on them? So I think we should be bringing this into the curriculum, at least.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation that's overdue. I think the media outlets have a responsibility to freelancers. I mean, it really comes down to dollar and cents. I'd like to think that the only reason that the Star sends us on hostile environment training courses is for our safety. Well, it's also for insurance. If you go on one of those courses, your insurance rate are substantially lower. Pardon? If someone asked how much, I don't know actually. Someone might be able to answer that. You know, I think when we purchase articles, $250 from a freelancer who's put their lives at risk. Well, what happens if something happens to that freelancer? I think as the media organization that purchased that, we have an obligation, and I don't think that is widely known. I don't know the policy at our paper.
Okay, I think we are actually starting to run out of time, so we'll take one more question.
I'm Jill Campbell-Miller. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo. And I have a question as a layperson about working in environments that are muzzled. And I spent a few months in Zimbabwe a few years ago. And it was a very muzzled environment. It was a very shut down environment in terms of speaking openly about politics and the situation going on there, at least when I was present. I mean, I'm sure people spoke in their own family environments and among their friends, but when I was present in a work situation or something like that, it was very shut down. And so and we couldn't even actually take pictures as tourists downtown. I have no pictures of Harare really, because there was a chance we would be mistaken for undercover journalists and arrested. And so I'm just curious, I have no idea as a layperson how a journalist can operate in an environment like that. And it was to the point where if someone did open up to you about politics, you almost didn't trust what they were saying because it was just kind of surprising that they would even talk to you. And so it's just it's a very broad question, but I was just curious about how journalists do go about operating in those environments and assessing sources and deciding what gets put in the report.
I'd like to field that one.
I could talk a little bit about Zimbabwe from people I know. I haven't been to Zimbabwe. I do know people who have snuck in. They basically lie to get in. They bring small cameras, and they make political connections. And so the people that they are brought to for interviews are going to feel safe enough to talk to them. But then you have to weigh, you know, whose picture might you show? What do you just talk about? It's very, very difficult. I think that often we wait for people to get out across the border and then we contact them. It's actually, it continues to be a black hole in terms of trying to find out what is really going on. Even today, there are all sorts of stories. It's not as necessarily as acute a problem as it was maybe in the like 3 years ago, but it's still a huge problem. But what you have are people who sneak in, and the New York Times did a lot of work in Zimbabwe at the time, probably when you were there. And it really was a case of, it became clear in the reporting that they were sneaking over the border and trying to function and then getting back in order to file the story at great risk. But in terms of talking to people, you do have to weigh that. Sometimes you have to leave people alone because you will put them at risk, even if they're willing to talk, and you know, to what end? Especially now, there was a time when it was going to go back to one country. Now it goes everywhere, and you have to weigh that, and sometimes you have to lose a story.
Sonia?
Yeah, I actually think that, there is no magic formula that journalists know. There's no, secret sauce that we're like, oh, this is how we, I mean, you look at the story of Dorothy Parvez, who tried to get into Syria. Yeah, Dorothy Parvez into Syria. She tried to get in, a Canadian journalist who was arrested and then, sent to Iran, subsequently released. But you know, a lot of these places are black holes. They're very difficult to get into. A lot of journalists do go on tourist, try to go on tourist visas, try to just get into the country. I think that when you're in a challenging environment like that, the one trick that I've learned is, and it's almost counterintuitive, you always want to rush to where the action is, you know, whether it's a press conference or whether it's, you know, Tahrir Square, you know, you want to go there and you want to be there. But I think especially in print, and you know, maybe in other media as well, it's so good to actually look away from the spotlight a little bit, to sort of go off the beaten path and find people to talk to you. I find generally people are more comfortable talking to you when the spotlight is not so bright on them. So, you know, go to a neighborhood as opposed to Tahrir Square. That's what I tried to do in Egypt. I tried to actually find people who were just kind of everyday. I mean, you know, I like to write about everyday people who maybe they weren't necessarily the protesters, but they were the ones sort of, you know, at home who maybe sympathized with them. So I think that if you try to, you know, it's one technique, and there are lots of others, but I think that a mistake that a lot of journalists make is that they always sort of rush to where everyone else is rushed. And then, you know, you all end up with sort of the same story that's incredibly muzzled. But if you look elsewhere, and if you look for small stories that are significant, then you can, or symbolic, you can usually, you know, tell something about the larger conflict or the larger issue going on.
And I think you have a responsibility to the people you go up to. So depending on what country you're in, I think many countries you have to assume that you're being watched closely, not to become paranoid, but the security service in, for instance, Pakistan, they would know every time a foreign journalist is in the country. Yemen, absolutely, you definitely stick out there. Syria is a country like that. I know one time when I was in Syria, the guy who was following me either wanted me to know or, you know, was not very, very good at it, because, you know, I could sort of see him dart behind a building every corner I went around. And so just by people that I would approach and try and talk to, that could actually, even if they didn't talk to me, that could put them at risk. So I think you've got to sort of be aware of that, watch your surroundings, and think about carefully who you talk to, how you talk to them. And also remembering that people who talk to you, you have to know where they're coming from. So sometimes too, you know, this all goes to checking out your sources. That could be interesting what they're saying, but then if you dig a little deeper to that person is, find out what their affiliation is. I mean, we're seeing that right now in Tripoli. The Western journalists who are there are very clearly being, you know, they're all at one hotel, they're being clearly taken out to one area each day so Gaddafi's forces can show what they want. And in that case, I mean, journalists are writing about that. But I mean, it's often there's propaganda, and you just have to be careful about it.
Well, thank you. It's hard to believe, but our time is coming to a very quick end. I would like to thank all of our panelists for what I think is a wonderful conversation tonight about a really important issue that we face, as I said at the beginning, whether it's in our own country or whether it's around the world. I'd like to call on Fred Kuntz now for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lynn. You're right, the time did go by too quickly. I could do this every night of the week. This is my environment. I love it. What I see here, of course, is incredible commitment to not just the business of journalism, but to big ideals, freedom of expression, true storytelling, and the value that brings to the world. What makes a great journalist? You know, you need so many good qualities. First of all, a command of the English language, the ability to write or speak incredibly well on air, and you know, courage, and then the power of observation and recognizing a story. But I think what also makes a great journalist is the heart to care. And you know, when you see people come out, whether it's from Ottawa or Toronto on a busy weeknight, and they all have very busy lives, for nothing but a bowl of soup, and some were even too late for that, to talk about this and share their thoughts about this, because they care so much about it. And when they talk about, you know, let's remember the journalists in these countries who live in these conditions and face these repressive conditions all the time. And let's remember the civilians who are also the victims of the wars that we're covering. And let's remember our rights and responsibilities as Canadians and our responsibility to vote. I mean, so many things you can care about, and great journalists care about a lot of things and care deeply. So I want to thank you all for caring and for coming here tonight. And let's have another thank you to our panelists.